Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Friday Focus. Slightly different this morning. This is a recorded session. So again, if you've got comments that you'd like to leave, please do put them there and we'll get back to you on LinkedIn or YouTube to engage with this conversation. Slightly different, as I say, this morning. We're actually speaking later this afternoon at the HMC Academic Deputies Conference in Stratford. And we thought it would be an appropriate point to have a conversation a little bit more about what the work of Smart Curriculum is doing, particularly in the area of school efficiency and relating to the ebook that I published earlier in the year, The Efficient School. And so we're the conversation this morning, I've invited my guest, my friend and colleague here, Richard Alton, is going to come and join me in a second. But just we saw him a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of episodes ago, talking about AI in school and the work that he's doing. But just to say, thanks for being here. Please do leave your comments. And then if you like, share or subscribe, depending on what channel you're watching on, so YouTube or Substack or Spotify or LinkedIn, do leave a comment, do get involved and do share this stuff around. But let's get down to the business of today. Richard, welcome. Nice to have you back. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Super to be here.
Listeners, just give an introduction to yourself and how, where you are with us with Smart Curriculum.
Yeah, super. Well, I mean, I've been in education for over 25 years and have mainly been teaching maths and science over that time. I've spent time in mainly independent schools, working as middle leader and subsequently for the last sort of 15 plus years, been working as deputy head in 2 HMC schools. Most latterly Epsom College, and then just from this September, so 3 months ago, and now working in a bit of a broader base of interests. You mentioned earlier that particularly passionate about use of technology and AI in schools, so working with an independent charity which I formed with Nancy Selden and others on AI in education, and also have the privilege of working with your good self in Smart Curriculum, looking at curriculum efficiencies and timetabling, which has been a passion of mine for many years as I work through, say, middle and senior leadership. Always been interested and involved in curriculum analytics and timetabling and how all that fits together. The core purpose of a school, really, isn't it, of course, is to ensure that you have an exciting, relevant and fit for purpose curriculum which meets the needs of all the pupils and learners.
And I mean, obviously, the context of where we are, we're a few days from the curriculum and assessment review being published, and there's lots of conversation. And interesting, I mean, that's a very state sector kind of oriented thing, that this is what state sector schools are funded to provide. But I know increasingly across the country and across the world, people are looking at that as being the kind of marker of what curriculum provision in the English orientation is like. And so people are very interested in not just in the state sector, that broader ideas of what that's bringing. Would you resonate with that, Richard?
Absolutely. British curriculum is still very, very highly respected across the world. And you only have to look at the proliferation of international schools which are in partnership with British schools. Many independent schools have partner schools abroad. And the demand is growing. Say the British curriculum is still seen as rightly as sort of the gold standard across the world, which is great. So as you rightly say, when we have a curriculum review and lots of really good and interesting things have come from that, then I agree. I think a lot of the people around the world are really interested in that.
I was at the Education Summit in London, Islington, a few weeks ago, where I think that what you've just said completely resonated around the room. So even Lord Jim Knight was there talking about his work, and I've recently met Sir Steve Smith, who's the British ambassador selling English education across the world, and you can't sit still. People are clamouring for what is seen to be a highly respected provision. I would say a lot of the provision is the end point that they're buying. They're looking for GCE, GCSE, Cambridge qualifications. They want the outcome. The journey to learning might be slightly different, and that's the richness of the independent education, because it doesn't have to do things in the way of Ofsted are going to say it needs to be this, it needs to be that. But it's an interesting journey, and that I think I know from the figures that we're seeing, exactly as you say, partner schools in abroad, they are looking for more involvement from the UK. They don't want it just by this and it's going to be there with sort of local partners. They want sort of seen through sort of involvement, so and that's going to bring its own challenges about schools having capacity to provide that, which kind of is the segue into this question, isn't it, about how do we run efficiently to become that provider. So how do we and that's a lot of focus on workforce, but it's not just workforce, it's about provision. So look, I can say I've got passion for this area, because I think schools, certainly the state sector needs to be getting the best out of the money that it has. And I've just come out of a conference call with people saying, doom and gloom, there isn't enough money to go around. The independent sector has been challenged over this last little while with tax. I mean, how have you felt that in the school? Not just where the schools generally.
I mean, the sector is facing challenges from VAT, no question. But I think, as you rightly say, running schools efficiently is an important concept for any school, and for independent schools just as much. So yes, there are financial pressures on independent schools, which perhaps weren't quite as acute 5 years ago as they are now. But nevertheless, I think across the country, I mean, I've been fortunate to work mainly in the southeast, where actually there are a high number of independent school pupils, but I know certainly schools across the country have found numbers a challenge, say even before VAT, and therefore your efficiency is really important. So yeah, I mean, an absolute key part, I think, for any school. And going back to your point about British curriculum or curriculum in general, it is, of course, every school, and certainly as an academic deputy or curriculum deputy, I think there's been some fantastic, innovative and expansive curriculums that schools have come up with. As you say, we're fortunate in the independent sector perhaps to have more scope for a little bit more variable curriculums than perhaps state schools may do. But nevertheless, I think there's been a lot of really interesting curricula. But you can come up with the most exciting and innovative and fit for purpose and expansive curriculum you like, but if ultimately you can't then staff it and afford it, then you're going to be in trouble. So I think a key balance, and of course what we'll be talking about this morning, will be how do you find that balance? How do you create a curriculum that is exciting, that is fit for purpose, and ultimately is educating your young people for the world that they are going to inhabit in the next sort of 10 years, which goodness knows what sort of life of technology and AI will be like in life in general, but certainly in the workplace. So how can we create that sort of curriculum that does ultimately prepare our young people for their futures, but at the same time make it affordable, make it efficient? Say whether you, as you say, there's financial pressures, whether you're in the state sector or the independent sector. You have to make your curriculum efficient and work with the resources you've got. And I think that's a really interesting challenge, which is facing, I think, all schools and will perhaps increasingly do so as we go forward.
And I think that's Richard. It might be, if I just give the sort of journey that I've been on to get to this point, because I know, and then perhaps, kind of where you started with it as a result of that. So in 2010, I stepped out of leading school and I started working with more and more schools across the country that were facing financial challenge. We know the headlines that read, 50% of the new academies were in deficit budgets. And we're not talking small amounts of money. I think the worst I've seen was a £4 million in-year deficit. So they were spending £4 million more than they were receiving. And obviously a school in that state, you can talk reserves all you like. There's no reserves on the planet that's going to cover that. And so there needed to be structural change to deal with it. Now, a lot of schools that I was working with, and I'm talking about 10s and 20s and 30s of schools that were in that position, right from the north of England to the very south of England. I think, from north of Newcastle to the Isle of Wight, I've been in schools in that position. And I started to see this method, and every one of those schools I worked with, without exception, we saw turnaround budgets within 18 months. And it was that start, and it was about practice and delivery. Now, I turned that into the methodology, which we know there are others around the country that have been doing similar because they've been picking up schools. But what I did was it got the interest of Lord Agnew when he was talking in 2017 about school efficiency. So, your colleague that's taken on the school, the name's just gone out of my head for a moment. So they came to you at Epsom, so there are others around. Anthony Seldon. There are people like him that so the Education Commission, the Times Education Commission, all the things that we're saying about schools, about all that we need this richness. When schools are saying we haven't got enough money to do this, there needs to be some shift. My concern was in that work with the department that it became compliance oriented. It was, this is the way to get out. And what I was seeing was challenging contexts around the country with different types of schools that wanted different messages. And I wrote something that I called the hatchet or the scalpel, you can choose. And it was effectively, you can go hacking at stuff, or you can understand and use a scalpel. You'll end up at the same point, but the damage you'll cause with the hatchet was my concern. Now, I'm not pointing that at the DFE at all. I'm just saying having metrics alone is not enough. You need to have that kind of level of deep understanding of how it applies, and context matters. And then that's where this has grown into the independent sector, the state sector, the international schools that are saying children in a classroom with an experienced teacher is the mode that we teach in. So how does that work, and how do we apply that broadly? So I brought that together in an ebook, which we took a little while to put together. And I guess, Richard, that's where you came in on it, isn't it? It is.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So sort of my journey to this point, if you like. Similarly, as I said, I've been curriculum deputy in schools for over 15 years, and timetabling much longer than that. So I've always been put curriculum together within the constraints that, of course, we have around staffing and resources and so on. So I was well used to doing that. But for most of the time I was doing that, if I'm honest, I was doing that not exactly by instinct, but to a certain extent based on sort of standard practices and things that have gone before. And I think having a real quantitative measure on curriculum provision and efficiency was not something that I really had. There were things that I developed. I mean, every curriculum deputy and every head will obviously have an eye on their curriculum plan and the number of staff they've got and how the staff are deployed across departments and so on. But I think having a more in-depth measure of how that all fits together was something that I was lacking, and certainly any school that I worked with or colleagues that I knew in other schools didn't really have those metrics at that time. Now, I think it was quite a different world back in 2010. Certainly in the independent sector, as mentioned about the financial headwinds that we have now. But and I think to some extent it was fine and it worked well at that time. But subsequently, I think there are rightly requests from heads and governors to have a real quantitative measure on how or sort of curriculum provision and staffing levels. Again, rightly, schools are businesses, so having key performance indicators that measure staffing levels and deployment and so on, those were quite hard to come by in my experience in years gone by. So developing just from simple measures like pupil-teacher ratios, I mean, that's a sort of standard measure.
Standard one, yeah.
Hopefully all schools are aware of. I mean, that's a great sort of overall, but there's obviously much more nuance to a school than that, but a good starting point. And then I started to look at a little bit of some of the basic curriculum or staff deployment analysis, which I think had evolved from its inception in the 1970s. I think T.I. Davis, I think, was the man who...
your late 60s, yeah.
Well, late 60s, okay. In Wales, yeah. And so that sort of evolved and developed, and Keith Johnson, who written a sort of seminal book on timetabling, developed this idea of bonus, which sort of gave a bit of a sense of your curriculum efficiencies across the different years. So I think that was a good start, and I used that a little bit. It wasn't quite so good for sixth form, where a lot of certainly independent schools have quite big sixth forms, and a lot of resource goes into your sixth form. So that wasn't quite so great there. And then you're right. Then I discovered your work and your curriculum metrics, which part of which was some of the work from Askell on the slightly tongue-in-cheek called Equation of Life, which let's talk about more in a moment, and then built on that the idea of curriculum enhancement, which, as I'm sure you'll testify, is a sort of an expansion and a more in-depth look at this idea of sort of bonus in different year groups. So I think it developed a really exciting and very relevant and important way of measuring your staff deployment, your curriculum efficiency, and actually you can have a real handle in a quantitative method of seeing how that works and how that evolves over time. And again, in my experience, I found some heads, some governors make a lot of assumptions about staffing levels, curriculum, based on instinct and inference, sometimes correctly, but not always.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And again, rightly, with the sort of scrutiny that's over costs in schools at the moment, and staffing, of course, is always the largest cost a school will have. I think to have a very in-depth, accurate, quantitative measure of this is really important, and will stop hairs running in governing bodies. And I've certainly sat in many governing meetings where wild claims of being overstaffed or X subject being super expensive, etc., with no real quantitative evidence base. And I think this now provides that, which, as I say, is ever more important for schools as they think carefully about efficiency and how they use their resources wisely.
I think that's a key part. I mean, there's several things you said there, Richard, about so there's legacy practice. We've always done it this way. So the challenge of we haven't got enough money now. So what are we going to change? Which is where the kind of hatchet comes in, where actually deep understanding, insight gets you to that point of, well, if we tweak this a little bit, we can that we're okay. But then so legacy practice is a big part of this. So what is it? But you're right, and I guess one of the things around the bonus question, and we will come into that, which is why I use this term about enhancement, because we do enhance several things. We enhance pay in a way to attract people into our organizations. We enhance teachers' experience in a way to keep them. And that's becoming a key thing. But very few people will look at the curriculum in a way of saying, well, where do we put our time and effort to the greatest benefit? How do we do that? Now, that an idea of enhancement is not bonus unless we really understand the baseline. And that's what is the minimum provision that we have to start with. Now, I guess they're the conversations that I've been having with school leaders across the country and further than that about, okay, so what's your minimum expectation? Where do you begin? And if that was challenged, how would you respond? Where do you go with that? Which is why all these kind of metrics, they're an indicator, but I think they're blunt tools if you're not careful with them.
Yeah.
And it's that next step. So do you want to, you've mentioned Askell's The Equation of Life.
Yeah.
We're probably wise to kind of show people what we mean, because
yes, indeed.
We are an Askell PD partner, so we work with them, and so that's why we're partly having some of these conversations. But let's just add it to the conversation. I'm going to make it a little bigger just to start with. So, Richard, tell us. This is in the book, so people can go and read it. But just a little.
Well, my understanding of this, I mean, Chris, obviously, I think you'll have a more in-depth understanding and perhaps a wider usage. But my understanding of this is a great starting point for looking at how your staff deployment and contact times are balanced over your entire school. So this is a metric that's used really sort of school-wide. Lots of acronyms here and equations, but just to try and talk through this as I understand it, but Chris, do also add your understanding as well. But so we've talked about the pupil-teacher ratio, the PTR. I mean, that's a really important measure in any school of how ultimately how many teachers you have compared to the number of pupils in your school. So that's the sort of starting point. And then really it creates two other numbers. And the idea is that if all things are in balance, these three numbers should be broadly equal. And if there's an imbalance, then that tells you something about the school, and may well be something intentional or may not be. So the second number, which has this ATC, the average teacher cost, divided by the revenue per pupil and the proportion of the revenue available for expenditure teacher costs, gives us sort of a sense, as I understand it, but say, Chris, you may add more to this, but it gives us a sort of a sense of how you're using your income, your resources that's coming in from your either your fees as an independent school or from the government as a state school. How are you using that on your staffing levels? Have you got an excess number of staff? Are you paying your staff quite well? Are they high on the teacher banding, on leadership scales, and so on? And it gives a bit of a sense of where I think your staffing levels and staffing pay fits in with your sort of overall teacher ratio. And as I say, ideally that number should match your pupil teacher ratio. Those two should be equal to each other. And then the third number looks at the contact ratio and the average class size. So this gives us a sense of how much your teachers are actually in the classroom. And we know, of course, with leadership points, both on sort of academic curriculum and the pastoral side, a number of teachers in leadership positions will, of course, not always be in the classroom full time, and that's understandable. And how do your class sizes vary across the year groups? You tend to perhaps have slightly smaller classes as the pupils get older, particularly in the sixth form. And how does that all fit in? So you're able to calculate three numbers from your school's, I suppose, information on their staffing levels and so forth, and then looking at the balance of those, I think is really important and a good starting point. Yeah. Chris, have I described that correctly?
Yeah, no, not setting you up in any way. It's good to hear. I mean, I kind of live and breathe this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's good to. I think you've got exactly right, and I think what I could perhaps do is bring to some of the characteristics of why that's what happens to those things. So, pupil teacher ratio is simply the more teachers you buy. If you don't have more children, the lower that number's going to go, because it's the number of children in your school compared with the number of qualified staff that you're buying. Now, that number, in the independent sector is kind of around 10, maybe slightly lower than 10. So, if you're the larger your population, the more staff you feel that you've got the comfortability to buy.
Yeah.
In the state sector, that number is actually around 21 in most schools. So you can see the difference between the experience. But teachers will tell you, well, I don't have classes of 21. My classes are nearer 30 in the state sector. And it's all to do with what I would refer to as a target average class size. What is your intent? That's where you begin. So the pupil teacher ratio is quite telling about the number of professionals you're buying for that full experience. And as you rightly said, there are lots of other people in the building that we're doing things. But if you're paying them as teachers, then that's a key part of the process. Average teacher cost, that's to do with where they are on the scales. And obviously, I find a lot of the independent sector and state sector are kind of on par, because it's about attracting people across that divide. So there's not such great difference, although there are in some. And obviously there's the revenue part, and how much you're spending on staff. Let's go into that. I think the interesting one is the contact ratio and the average class size. That's the one that people go to, because it's the teacher's experience, how much time you facilitate them to do the job, and what they're going to do in the classroom. And I often say to leaders when I go in there, just, if you're struggling to understand the contact ratio, stand in the corridor now, and whatever number that says, that's the number of people as a percentage of your staff that are facing children now. The ones that, so if it's a 70% contact ratio, 70% of your staff are facing children, 30% are doing other parts of the job. If it's below that, if it's 60%, then 40% of your staff are doing other things. And are those other things purposeful? Are they're there for, it's fit for purpose? Or is it just bought time that isn't intended, and you will use it because it's there? So that's where the efficiency question comes in. Does that round that off, Richard? Does that make sense?
That's great. Absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully compliments.
Shall I move to the
please do, yeah.
Sorry, that didn't move quickly enough. Let me just find my mouse. Hang on. Okay, carry on talking, and I'll moving.
Yeah, so we're going to look at a sort of case study. Here we are. So as I mentioned, my experience is in the independent sector. So here is some figures from a couple of years ago from a day boarding school. Chris, you mentioned about differences in different schools. So to sort of throw in as well, in the independent sector, there's sort of boarding element, which the vast majority of state schools, of course, don't have, and that affects things. So here's some case study figures, quite interesting. So you can see that the pupil teacher ratio is sort of 8.9, so around about 9. I think that's fairly typical for a sort of day boarding school in the independent sector, with a number of staff needed on the sort of boarding side of things. The central number, which gives a sense of how teachers are paid and deployed. Well, in this example, those numbers, the first two numbers are pretty similar, so 8.9 and 9.1, so minimal difference. Interesting, the third number in this example does actually look significantly higher, so up to 10.5. So that is quite an increase, and that, as we talked about, is around about the contact time and the average class size. So that raises an interesting question here: are the class sizes on average perhaps slightly smaller than they might otherwise be? So sixth form, of course, would be a key input to these numbers, and there may be a number of classes in the sixth form which are pretty small, maybe some subjects which are running single or even low single figures. And that may be very, very, very desirable for various reasons, but of course does have an impact on cost and efficiency. But also, again, in this example, being a day boarding school, the contact ratio, as you described, nicely, Chris, may well be again relatively low. There will be a number of teachers who will be involved in boarding houses, and therefore will not be in a classroom as much as maybe other schools. So I think that sort of tells, just these three numbers tells quite an interesting story about how the school's sort of running. And put at the bottom there sort of benchmarks question mark, because I think one thing I'm really interested in doing is sort of getting a sense of actually how typical this pattern is in, say, independent day boarding schools. And one thing we'll talk about this afternoon, actually, at the conference, as you mentioned, is how we can potentially utilize hopefully an interested group of academic deputies to perhaps put some comparisons here, because I think this is a fairly typical picture in a day boarding school, but it might not be. And I think it'd be really interesting to see how those numbers compare. But I think with a relatively simple calculation, you've actually got quite a good sense here, I think, of how the school's set up in terms of its efficiency. And this might be something I mentioned about key performance indicators earlier. This might be something that should be monitored over time, and therefore may form some sort of efficiency measure, which could contribute to some KPIs going forward. And I think it'd be really interesting how schools evolve as they perhaps change focus as they go forward.
And I mean, there's a couple of bits here. I'm just going to put across the bottom of the screen. There's a contact email address there for Smart Curriculum or our office number. And I think it's, as you said, there is no kind of baseline benchmark, and this ASCL. I mean, the reality is it's been around for a lot of years. We are actually going to show you another example of another way of looking at it. But if you are interested in forming some kind of position, please do get in contact with us, and we can talk to you about how we might, as an ad hoc approach, get some information around if you're interested to see this, because there's some characteristics exactly as you've described that there are some things that matter that schools might be interested in developing. But I'll show you details of the book and how you could get the book later on. But if you're interested in that, please do get in touch and just let us know that you might be interested in a further conversation on it. I'll leave that running for a moment. Richard, maybe I just take us into the kind of next step of what Smart Curriculum does in comparison with that. So if I put on the screen, so this is a typical dashboard that we use with schools, and in fact, actually, so there's three basic columns, if you can see this. So the curriculum enhancement, the curriculum detail on the left, the staffing in the middle, and the finance on the right. So we've so three pillars of details. On the left-hand side, that coloured bar, the red, the yellow, amber, and the green, is basically saying that the school that we're analysing here has got a curriculum that's bigger than the number of children in the school can sustain. So there's actual cost to that. The relative extra value of that is somewhere around £600,000 to £700,000 of staffing to achieve that level, which is really significant amounts when people are getting to that efficiency. But if you look at the chart below it, so the kind of profile chart, it's actually saying that a lot of time, a lot of that contributing element, it's exactly what you described a minute ago, Richard. You said that when this analytics has been done, the sixth form has not been represented well because the characteristic of it is different to what's going on in the rest of the school. So our analytics actually varies through the school, and we say, well, what's your intention? So if you start from nursery, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1 to 13, which is in the framework, the national framework for early years provision. Then 30, which is typical state sector independent. There's a state sector class size in primary. In independent sector, it's a lot less than that. So you might be saying 10 or 15. And then moving to key stage 3, 7, 8, 9, first year, second year, third year, whichever language you use. That larger class size in that that area. And then what happens in the sixth form? You said earlier, so single figures, 6, 7 is not unusual in a sixth form. If you're offering music or you're doing dance or drama, or you maybe even physics, because you've got less people engaged. But what we do is say, well, what is your intent? What is it that you're aiming for? And the chart that you can see there, the indicator, is really around the sixth form is actually smaller than their intent, and they've developed this position. Now, if I move that over to the right hand side, where you're looking at the financial benchmarking, you can see on the top chart there's an indicator that says the actual paying of the staff is much higher than would be typical. Now, here we've got a school that is in a position of deficit. They're not bringing enough money to pay the sustainable future. But the two questions are, is the curriculum the right size? And what about how we're paying the staff? Now, in this case, the staff salaries were probably slightly higher than they intended or they could afford. But the question here was about sustainability, the stability of the school. They wanted to see the school stay stable. They wanted to maintain a kind of status quo, but they'd got to a point that it was really undeliverable. Now, changing staff salaries is a difficult thing to do. That's not an easy process to go through, but there are many criteria here that were kind of impacting it. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the story there, but that's kind of what this thing is showing us. Here's another one where this is an all-through existence. It's actually an independent school. You can see here where the curriculum is a very different shape. Lots of investment early on, lots of investment right the way through the school. You can see that profile chart. It's quite an interesting one, but then we haven't got time to go into the depths of it. But you'll notice that the staff remuneration is in a completely different position. So it's a very different characteristic. In this case, it was about sustaining something that kept them in a competitive market live. So there were lots of decisions that were being made that were about sustaining this position. Now, you could argue, do you have a competitive advantage if you're not paying staff at the same levels? Well, that was one of the questions that was kind of being asked, and the kind of the roots out of that might be much deeper. So you'd be asking kind of some different questions. And there again, another school in a very similar position. You see here, very invested in sixth form, really conversation about sixth form. But this school, everything else is pretty much on, apart from that size of curriculum. And again, that's the analytics is getting really deep into what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How could we do it differently? What's the kind of profile that would impact what we're about? Now, this is not the place to go deep into these charts. But Richard, do you see that's different from just having three numbers?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the three numbers, I think, is a great sort of starting point and introduction to getting a sort of sense of this. But you're absolutely right. This then builds on those ideas in much more detail, which is fantastic. And what I really like about these dashboards, Chris, is as you've described, that sort of relationship between the curriculum enhancement, the staffing, and then the finance is so important. And again, in my experience in schools, the finance seems to be quite a sort of separate, disparate issue to curriculum. And I've been in many meetings over the years where the finances have been some sort of opaque issue, which has often been in independent schools given to a bursar, traditionally called, and their team. And it might be, as a curriculum deputy, you come out of a meeting and think, we might need one extra member of staff for XYZ because the numbers choosing one subject has changed. And really, you're going to the bursar cap in hand and saying, can we have one more extra staff? And sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. And there isn't really a joined up thought about how, as you have shown there how the curriculum and the different year groups and the different structures impact your staffing levels, which then impact your financial position. That, in my experience, hasn't always been as well thought through as it should and could be. And I think, as I've said a number of times, going forward will become ever more important. So I think this is, say, with a sort of curriculum deputy hat on, really exciting way of being able to see in a sort of visualization of how one thing's affecting another. So too often these things are in silos, so curriculum, staffing levels, finance, and clearly they do affect each other, but often it's not easy to see. And as I mentioned earlier, governors, I think, would be really interested to see, effectively on a single screen, how all those three things interact. And that if you are thinking about a development plan, changing your curriculum, developing your curriculum, number of schools, partially in response to the curriculum review, but partially just as they evolve, are looking at tweaking shapes of school days and curriculum shares for different subjects. I think this is a really key input into that, so you can see the financial impact that a change in curriculum model would have. And so in my experience, often that hasn't happened. So yeah, I think it's really exciting and lots that can be beneficial here.
I just on that, I mean, we are running a number of projects at the moment where independent and state sector schools are saying exactly as you've said, we want to change the day. And particularly we saw lots of it post-COVID. So people thinking about the kind of granularity of a day, lots of, even 5-hour periods or 6 50-minute periods or even 8 35-minute periods, and the kind of movement that's creating around the building, and the idea of having deeper experiences. Now, I know a number of schools that have moved to quite long periods and less of them, but that has issues around proportionality of stuff. I'm not saying that's the best answer. I think particularly in the independent sector, lunch and enrichment or co-curricular activities have a big part to play, as you're saying, that richer provision. So, and we're doing a number of those projects at the moment. But the impact on the proportionality of staff is huge. So music and arts and DT. Actually, I was just at a meeting I was in a moment ago, actually talking about the curriculum assessment review impact, and actually questioning whether it's deliverable because of the requirements of staffing and whether they're there. And again, that's another thing that the analytics is really saying. So where's the need, and can we? I talk a lot about workforce projection. So where is this going? Not just in terms of cost, but in terms of expertise. But sorry, Richard, go.
I was going to say, I mean, just picking up the point we made earlier, absolutely. It's absolutely right that schools should be thinking about their curriculum, and I applaud the government for their curriculum review and a lot that's come out of it. But it's very easy to say we need to teach 3 separate sciences, or we need to have more in the curriculum around financial literacy, digital literacy, technology. As of course, that's so important. But ultimately, as you rightly say, we've got to resource that, and it's the easy bit to a certain extent, and almost the fun bit to come up with the grand ideas and the philosophies. The challenge then is, as you rightly say, is to structure it and to resource it, given all the financial constraints that every school faces. And this is where I think the reality comes together with the philosophy.
And just not to lose the other. So, I guess there's slight frustration in me, and we still have this view of the bursar, the business manager on one side and the educationalists on the other, and almost never the twain shall meet. I see the job as the connective tissue that brings both of those. So KPIs that one might be looking for are different from the KPIs that another person's looking. So the educations are about outcomes, they're about its success, where the business lead, the bursar, and so on is about financial stability and pupils in the door, and don't like that word, but kids on seats, bums on seats, that kind of, it's not, but joining those up. So what difference does it make? And I've had lots of conversations with schools where it's okay, so putting a £500 advert on the back of a bus to attract 3 students is actually good value for money, because that brings maybe 30k in, where £500 to do that is worth the money. There's lots of, not to say that everybody should be doing that, but that's it's a very popular advertising route. But the bursar is going to be running that through their KPIs. Have we got enough people? Have we got the traction? Have we got the flow through?
Absolutely.
So sorry, go on.
I would say it's all interrelated. So absolutely right. And say too often these are thought about in isolation.
And the other part I just will emphasize, because it's something that gets lost. You rightly say that governing bodies and trust boards need to be engaged in this conversation. They need to be involved. One thing that we've done within Smart Curriculum is not just put metrics on a board, but actually the dashboards have been really helpful in governor conversations to say, I don't want to know the detail, but give me the overview. So that dashboard that you've just seen, so why are we paying that level? Why is the curriculum here? Is that proportionality right? Are we meeting the needs of all of our learners in the way that's best for them? And those kind of governance questions are really key. So, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, it's actually really, really difficult being a governor. I'm actually a school governor myself, and actually it's a really tricky balance between not getting too bogged down in the operational details, which absolutely rightly is the preserve of the head teacher and the senior leadership team, and yet still being aware enough of how the school is running to be confident and to do your job as a governor, that you are actually governing the school. And certainly in my experience, again, it's too easy to get bogged down in detail, particularly in my case, obviously as an educationist on a governing body, and there will be a range of backgrounds. But I've certainly been in governing meetings where we've got too detailed, and this is really, it's really been the preserve, as I say, of the senior team. And at other times, it's been too broad brush, and it's been the head almost saying, well, the school's running fine, so thanks very much. Here's your tea and biscuits. See you in 6 months. So it's finding that balance, and I think it's difficult as a governor. And again, this is I think an understandable metric which has sufficient balance between being high level and also actually understanding what's going on the ground of the school, that would allow governors, I think, to have that appropriate level of understanding and scrutiny, and asking the right questions. In a way that, again, that hasn't really often happened in my experience.
And I think that you've hit it there. That our drive, and we have a setup within the analytics. It is actually that in the reporting that we do, there is a series of questions, and it's actually leading governors to say, ask these questions, because these are the questions that are high-level strategic things that matter, and the answers you get both feed understanding, but also drive change, and that's the kind of necessity. Richard, I know that there's one other chart that you wanted to look at. So shall I put it back on the screen and just let's just this thing about enhancement. Let's have a look.
Building on what I was saying, my experience of starting with the equation of life, working with some more in-depth analytics that you very ably describe in your book, Chris, enables schools to create this idea of enhancement relatively easily, and the methodology is all in the book. So this is a sort of fairly typical independent school curriculum based on curriculum that I've been working with in a number of schools over the years, and it tells quite an interesting story. Again, one perhaps that isn't desperately surprising, but I think asks rightly some questions. So we've mentioned a number of times that the sixth form is particularly resource heavy, and I think this sort of chart shows that, and particularly in this example, year 12, which I think had a slightly more extended curriculum, a number of additional options were in the lower sec. Things like extended project qualification is quite a common thing that happens in year 12. So I think this is really interesting, and you showed similar graphs on your dashboard, but it gives a real, I think, stark picture of really where that resource is going to. A lot into year 12, significant amount to year 13, and actually year sort of 8 and 9, perhaps a bit more efficient, perhaps less resource heavy, and that may be exactly how you'd like to design your curriculum. So a reasonable resource goes into year 7 as the pupils arrive in the school. Once they're settled in, maybe they don't need as much resource in 8 and 9. Then obviously as they go into year 10 and 11 doing their GCSEs, the resource goes up, and then into year 12 and 13. So maybe this is exactly what you want, but I think having it quantified in such ways, I mean, my instinct would be that it looks like year 12 is particularly resource heavy compared to the other years. And so I think if you are thinking of developing and enhancing your curriculum as you go forward, then I think a key question, if this sort of what your enhancement model shows, would be, is that really what you want? Do you want to put quite so much resource into year 12, or could there be benefits of spreading it a bit more evenly?
And I think there's the kind of narrative that I would work through with people is, if you look at that, if you're looking left to right, and I refer to it as the learning continuum. If you think on the left, they are the more dependent learners. They need teachers. On the right, they are the less or the lesser dependent learners. And exactly using your kind of description, Richard, it's where we are putting the valuable resource, and it is quite heavily in year 12.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's the bigger question of, on that learning continuum, where you've got the most dependent learners on the left and the least dependent learners on the right, is this a logical structure?
Yeah.
And I guess that opens the questions for our methodology, our pedagogy, our practice. And it's really just open the question. What would it look like if we did it differently? And that's why we get into modeling. That's not to say right or wrong. It is, it is what we do. We've got used to it. It's what's embedded. But I guess the question within the bigger vision of the efficient school, one would ask that question. If you're looking at dependency of learners on the expensive resource, where would we put that to the greatest effect? And that's the question it asks. And that's why I talk about enhancement rather than the idea of basic and bonus.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like, well, where we can add, we'll add. But actually, it's not strategically focused around need. And guess, with all the emphasis on special education needs, I think there's some practice changes that are needed in structure to deal with that. But it does ask you the question, if I mapped against that, the needs of learners in terms of special education needs, it's fascinating. And we do in our analytics, we show that the chart that you're seeing there against the profile of learners. And they're often a considerable dissonance between how it's structured, because that's legacy, that's what we've always done, to where the need's actually sitting now. So we find that narrative really kind of a positive step, and that's where curriculum analytics has got its greatest strength.
And I think allied to that is we mentioned right at the start actually of the sort of gold standard of British curriculum, and there's lots to like about the British curriculum, but one thing that is debatable is that narrowing of choice, or the choice that's then narrows the curriculum as you go forward. And again, I think one thing that comes out of perhaps looking at that enhancement is how the choice that then pupils can make into their GCSEs, and then even more so into their A levels, that the wider you make that choice, that perhaps more challenging it can be to resource it. And again, is that right? Is it right to give the pupils real wide range of choices. I mean, educationally great, but that's hugely resource heavy, as you say, potentially at the detriment of some of the younger years when the choice is pretty limited. But maybe that's the time that they do need more teacher input when they're less independent. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and a balance for all schools of how flexible and how much choice do you give in those higher years. And in that example we saw in year 12, there's probably an awful lot of choice, which is super in one respect, but you can see that the resort, how that affects the resource allocation. So I think that's a fascinating conversation that all schools should be engaged in as they go forward.
And it's got to start from, and I go back to that, what is your intent? So yes. The target average class size. So what it's not just, well, we'll just roll with it. What happens. Mm-hmm. You need a kind of understanding of where that is. And I know lots of sixth form leads and curriculum leads kind of struggle with that because they're kind of waiting for the choice, the options, the process. But you've got to have some understanding of your own capacity before you get into that conversation, because there's no point offering courses that you then are going to find, we're now struggling to fill them because on the breadth.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
And say, we'll provide staff to teach them. Yeah.
And that's the biggest question now, particularly with some of the opportunities that are coming in. Can we say again the curriculum assessment review and what they're saying post 16? There's some real opportunity, but have you got the resource to provide it? Richard, I'm conscious in terms of time. We're getting close.
We can chat all day.
Well, we've had a good chat on the process. So we are speaking this afternoon at the HMC conference at the Crown Plaza in Stratford upon Avon, which will be a pleasure. So if you're there, come and say hello, please do. Both of us will be around during the afternoon. I think, Richard, you're there for a bit longer than that, but so do come and talk to us.
In the evening, yes.
Yes, we'll be there in the evening. If you're not at the conference, the contact details that I put on the screen a moment ago, I'll put them back on the screen here. Do drop us a line if you're interested in the conversations. Please just come and talk to us. And I will. I'm going to add to the. Richard, this may just come over your face for a moment, but the book details, if you want to know a little bit more about what we've been talking about, what Richard read, what I wrote a year ago, the QR code will take you. So it's an ebook. It's available on Amazon. Please use the QR code and get a copy for yourself. But then more than just reading it, please do come and talk to us about what you found and how you've worked it. So what we've said earlier about coming and engaging with us, and maybe us getting a picture of what's real, what's live, what's happening on the ground, particularly in these challenging times, would be really important to us. So both of us would be really interested to engage in that conversation. Richard, is anything to finish with? We're ready to talk this afternoon.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've covered an awful lot, but as I've said a number of times, I think becoming more and more critically important that schools and school leaders understand how these metrics all mesh together. So I would encourage any school leader to really try and get a handle on how your curriculum, staffing, and finances all fit together. It'll be ever more important as we go forward.
Absolutely. So I'm going to leave. Richard, thank you. We're talking this afternoon. I'll just do the last bits. Do stay with me for a second. So I'm going to leave this on the screen. So if you would like to get a copy of the book, it's an ebook. Download it on your device. You can see that on Amazon. It's available to purchase now. Please do get and go, but just engage with us because this is something that's growing in understanding. We've been through lots of iterations of metrics and so on, but people are really getting into, so what does the efficient school look like? What does it feel like? What's the child's lived experience? What's the staff's lived experience? That's the bit that motivates me to keep doing this and keep going in this journey. And more people are asking those questions. So please do engage on the podcast. Thank you for being here. Like, share and subscribe. Really That's really helpful in terms of spreading the message. But a very different conversation this morning. Next week, 2 weeks time, we're back to a normal conversation as we are having. Thanks for being here. Our sister podcast, the Leadership Compass, is available on Substack. We're developing that. That's mostly me talking about the newsletter material that's going out. We've just published one on the curriculum assessment review. I've got a deep dive into that. Please do go to Substack and see that. You're welcome to join us there. But thanks for being here. Really appreciate this. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.